Back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, what's sometimes called the old economy, the Federal Reserve tried to stimulate consumer demand by keeping interest rates low. You can imagine what happened. Consumers obliged, when interest rates fell, by going out and buying homes and cars and spending heavily, financed by borrowing heavily. So every time interest rates fell, as you can see in any of the charts, in any of the graphs or diagrams in charts 6.1 and 6.2, anytime interest rates fell, consumers borrowed heavily. Now, when consumers borrowed and spent heavily, demand surged forward based on rising expenditures on homes and autos. As demand surged forward, remembering our lessons from modules 4 and 5, the economy was pushed forward, rising levels of capacity utilization, deteriorating efficiency, rapidly rising costs. Inflation rose. As inflation rose, the Federal Reserve decided to deal with that rising inflation by switching from an easy expansionary policy toward a tight money or contractionary policy, forcing interest rates upward. And so you can see periodically interest rates rose. Now, unfortunately for the Federal Reserve found that surging inflation required the Federal Reserve to push interest rates during each cycle up higher than they had been before. And as a consequence, although periods of expansion, easy money policy sent interest rates south, the following periods of contraction, interest rates rose even higher and to a higher peak than they had been before. And so, although the Federal Reserve's bias was to stimulate demand by keeping rates low, what the Federal Reserve found that is after every binge of falling rates, demand reacted so favorably and so strongly, inflation rose to new highs, and the Fed had to help interest rates and permit interest rates and encourage interest rates to also rise to new highs. And so as a consequence, interest rates over time surged upward. All the peaks were higher and all the troughs were higher. And after all, this makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you think about the private economy, if you think about the banking system, what banker is going to lend at a rate of interest that is less than the rate of inflation? If the rate of inflation is 10% a year, no banker over the long run can survive by lending at a rate less than 10% a year, because at a rate less than 10% a year, the banker in real terms is not even recovering his loan. So as a consequence, over time, interest rates rose with inflation. Now finally, around 1980, in the early 80s, with a new chairman of the Board of Governors by the name of Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve changed its policies. And it switched from promoting expansion as a regular day in, day out priority to curbing inflation. And as the Federal Reserve switched its priorities, in my view, that created the most important turning point in our post-World War II economic history. Because from then on, when you examine chart 5.1, you'll see the rate of inflation tending downward. And so interest rates trail downward following that. Now you might say, well, why did interest rates fall in the long run when the Federal Reserve's bias was toward restriction? Because what the Federal Reserve found was that if it did periodically raise rates, that restricted demand to such an extent that as expenditures fell and demand cooled off, the rate of inflation plunged, and therefore, in order to get borrowing stimulated and growing again, the Federal Reserve found it would have to lower interest rates quite a bit in order to stimulate demand again. And so we find that as the rate of inflation fell, the rate of interest fell along with it. And so over time, the interest rates have fallen. And that pattern prevailed right up until the 1990s and the introduction of the new economy, the high-tech economy, which, as you know from our earlier modules, was fueled by business expenditures on high technology, high-tech equipment and software. Now, what happened in the late 90s, just before the dot-com bubble burst, the Fed did become somewhat alarmed by the expansion, did become somewhat alarmed by the rise in prices, and did force interest rates upward again. Then we hit the recession of 2000, 2001, the slump right into 2002, and you can see what the Federal Reserve did. Through a series of moves, the Federal Reserve allowed interest rates to fall down to, while they may not have been record lows, the federal funds rate, as shown on this particular graph, fell down to levels which were almost as low as they had been way back, about 50 years earlier. Now, by this time, of course, Paul Volcker was no longer the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Alan Greenspan was the new chair, and this decline in interest rates worked because although it did not immediately stimulate business expenditures on new plant and equipment, it did have a very, very beneficial effect on, as you know, household expenditures on residential construction and automobiles. And so these low rates stimulated rapid increase in home construction and automobile purchases, and only as the economy began to pick up again and surge forward did the Federal Reserve once again shift back to its prime focus, keeping inflation low. And then, of course, it saw to it that rates rose. It pushed rates up again to the 5% level. Now, by 2005, 2006, 2007, the present date, of course, the economy was surging once again, and the Federal Reserve once again shifted back to its primary concern, the primary concern it's had over the past 27 years. That is, keeping inflation under control and making sure prices don't rise too rapidly. Now, from all this discussion of rates and Federal Reserve policy, it's clear that borrowing and spending are the linchpins of all this and what the Federal Reserve is trying to influence. And as we move along now, we will also begin to discuss private borrowing, which the Fed, through its actions, attempts to control.